Welcome to session number 53 of Mark. We're in chapter 10, looking at verses 35 through 45. Title, Israel, Jericho, and Bartimaeus. As Jesus and the 12, along with a bunch of pilgrims for the Passover, they're on their way to Jerusalem, and we're going to find them crossing the Jordan from Perea, which is where we suspect Jesus has been prior to this moment, and they're going to pass through Jericho. Well, this is the only visit of Jesus to Jericho, as far as I can remember, being recorded in Scripture. But before we get there, I need to tell you something about the area, because otherwise you're going to see people harping about you saying, well, there's a contradiction between the various Gospels. No, there isn't. Jericho, you remember, was destroyed as the walls crumbled and Israel marched in to take over as they entered, just shortly after they had entered Canaan. This was after they had been released from Egypt. There was a curse awaiting anyone who tried to rebuild Jericho on that site. I'm going to read from Joshua 6, verse 26. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, cursed before the Lord, cursed before Yahweh, is the man who rises up and builds this city, Jericho, with the loss of his firstborn son. He shall lay its foundation. Translation, this is a curse on anyone who attempts to rebuild Jericho at that spot. And it says if you do it, you're going to do it with the loss of your firstborn as you lay its foundation, and with the loss of your youngest son, he shall set up its gates. So this was a pretty harsh curse. Read also from 1 Kings 16, verse 34. In his days, Hiel, Hiel, the Bethelite, built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. So a new Jericho was built by Herod the Great, and was close by the tell that was left in its place. The tell usually looks like a very small mound of dirt, a small hill, if you please, that covers over the old site or the old city. So there was a new one built, but it wasn't at exactly where the old city had been. The new city was located about a mile south of the tell. The new Jericho was a fine city with dripping wealth. What else was I going to say about something? The city on the old site where the tell was, as I've called it, I'm not sure it's exactly what they would call a tell, but that's the best way I can describe it. So at the time of Jesus then, both the tell and the city were generally called Jericho, though the tell was virtually uninhabited. Well, let me go on now to Mark 10:46, where it speaks of Jesus' arrival at Jericho. And notice it just says Jericho. It doesn't say New City Jericho or Old Jericho. It just says Jericho. So whether the tell, and it says, and they came to Jericho. Whether the tell or the New Jericho, Mark doesn't tell us. And as he, Jesus, was going out from Jericho with his disciples, that be with his 12, and a great multitude, these would be pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem for the Passover. It says, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. That's what Bartimaeus means. Bar is Aramaic for son, so Bartimaeus would be son of Timaeus. He was sitting by the road. So there's the scene. The group evidently enters and passes through Jericho. Again, whether it was the old site of Jericho or the new city of Jericho, we're not told. But there was a large group of pilgrims with Jesus and the 12 as they passed out of Jericho. That's interesting. We would assume Jesus is once again in the lead as rabbi. And then sitting along the road begging is a man called Bartimaeus, named only by Mark, by the way. He is, Matthew, for example, talks about the man, but he does not name him. Again, the name is Aramaean, Aramaean, from the older version. Aramaean was very similar to Hebrew, by the way. Hebrew would have been Ben Timaeus, not Bar, but it's close. A blind man begging along the road would have been a common sight. I mean, what are blind people going to do in that time, in that culture? There was no Social Security, so the only means they had of support was begging. So you would have expected to have seen these people. So there's nothing unusual except for the possibility of a need that Bartimaeus had. But just a typical scene. And again, was he leaving the old city area of Jericho that was destroyed, or was he leaving the new Jericho? We're not told. Why do we go to such trouble to make this introduction elaborate? Well, it's something that you'd expect to be normal, but because of the gospel, the words of the gospel writers appear to be at odds. That's the thing I mentioned just a moment ago. Let me read from you Matthew 29 and part of 30 in chapter 20. So it's 20 verses 29 and 30. And as they were going out from Jericho, a great multitude followed him. So Matthew has said they're going out of Jericho. Mark has said out of Jericho. Verse 30, and behold, 2 blind men sitting by the road. Somebody said, see here, you got one of them only Bartimaeus, on the other you got 2. Which is it? And the answer is probably 2, but Mark chose to concentrate on the one named Bartimaeus. Matthew has the group leaving Jericho. Whether the tell or the new city, Matthew doesn't say either, but he agrees with Mark. But he does say there were two blind beggars along the road. And again, Mark does not mention the second beggar. It doesn't mean he wasn't there. It doesn't mean that Mark is wrong if there was only one, because he doesn't say there's only one. He just speaks of the one. So Bartimaeus was of some interest, I guess, to Mark, but because it may seem simply streamlined his narrative of this event. But whether you consider one or two blind men, there was a beggar sitting there, and Jesus was about to pass by. So, was Mark in error? No. Is there a contradiction between Mark and Matthew? No. One simply chose to focus on the one rather than on the fact that there were two. But we're still not out of the detail woods. I'm going to read now from Luke 18:35. And it came about that as he, Jesus, was approaching Jericho, a certain blind man was sitting by the road begging. Now, Matthew and Mark said this was occurring as Jesus was leaving Jericho. Luke says it happened as he was approaching Jericho. A certain blind man was sitting by the road begging. Notice Luke only mentions a man also. He says that the event with Bartimaeus happened as a group was approaching Jericho, not leaving it. So which was it? Leaving Jericho or approaching Jericho? But, because there are two Jerichos, both are possible and not contradictory. Leaving the tell called Jericho while approaching the new Jericho, with Bartimaeus somewhere in that mile between the two places. Well, what was going through Bartimaeus' mind? Enough on the contradiction aspect. Let's go and look and see what Bartimaeus had on his mind. I'm reading from Mark 10:47 now. But when he, that's Bartimaeus, heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, evidently he must have known that name, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Son of David, of course, is a messianic title. So did he see Jesus as the Messiah? We do not know that for sure, but he did say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. In Luke 18:36 through 39, he explains that Bartimaeus inquired as to what was happening and learned that Jesus was passing by. In other words, Jesus has got people around him, many people around him, so there was considerable noise, and Bartimaeus, who couldn't see, could only hear. So he said, hey, what's happening? And when they told him it was Jesus, he then went into action because simply he was blind. You would assume he wants to see, and depending on what he had heard for Jesus, about Jesus, that he would probably have heard that Jesus was a powerful man with a propensity to heal. And so he knew that Jesus was a son of David. He knew that Jesus exhibited miraculous power, apparently, with his propensity. As I said, it's a nasty word to try and say, and three syllables, with a propensity to heal. So he knew some things about Jesus, but let me ask you, have you ever considered that the general population in the Israel of that day likely all knew that Jesus was a descendant of David? You see that popping up every once in a while. So it's very likely knew that Jesus was known as a descendant of David or a son of David. How many of them saw it as a messianic title? We don't know. But anyhow, Bartimaeus sprung into action by calling to Jesus with that messianic, I still having trouble with multiple syllable words, with the messianic title, Son of David. He calls on Jesus, and the crowd objected to his efforts and tried to stifle him. Evidently, they thought that that would bother Jesus to be called by this blind man. Verse 48, and many, those in the crowd, were sternly telling him, Bartimaeus, to be quiet, knock it off, guy. But he kept crying out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. So he has not asked him to heal his blindness. He said, have mercy. He wanted Jesus' attention, that's clear. He refused to shut his mouth and in Jesus' presence, in spite of those from the crowd giving him a hard time and telling him to knock it off. Another question for you. Do you think the 12 might have been among those attempting to silence Bartimaeus? Yeah, they've tried to keep kids from him. They've tried to do other things that were not in Jesus' mind. So it seems entirely possible. Remember the issue of the 12 trying to keep the children from bothering Jesus, and he said, don't do that, let them come. Well, Bartimaeus' efforts paid off big time. Verse 49, and Jesus stopped and said, call him here. Evidently, he was not exactly where Bartimaeus was, but he said, I hear him, call him, bring him here. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take courage, arise. He, Jesus, is calling for you. Do you think Bartimaeus had any idea that Jesus would turn aside from his journey to minister to him? I think so. I think he knew that part of Jesus' reputation was that he wanted to help people. Another question, could Jesus calling him seem to include a rebuke of the crowd that was trying to shut him up and who called Jesus by his messianic title? I think he was telling the crowd, don't stop him, bring him here. Jesus had clearly heard something. What do you think he heard? Well, of course, he probably heard Bartimaeus calling out, otherwise he would have not known, or would he? Did he hear Bartimaeus using the term Son of David? Did he hear the crowd's attempt to silence Bartimaeus? We're not told, but when you look at it, you'd almost say all of the above. Bartimaeus' response, you guessed it. Says verse 50, casting aside his cloak, he, Bartimaeus, jumped up and came to Jesus. Now, that's kind of interesting because he's blind. he jumps up and takes off. Somehow he must have got some help. The rest, as they say, is history. And we can read that history in verses 51 and 52. Answering him, Bartimaeus, excuse me, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" Let me start over again. Mark 10:51 and 52. And answering Bartimaeus, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" Because Bartimaeus had not said specifically. And the blind man said to him, Jesus would have known he was blind. So Jesus probably could have guessed what he wanted, but he asks him because the man's going to use his faith in Jesus to ask. Rabboni, I want to regain my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. No mention that he touched him, did anything with his eyes. He just said, go your way, your faith made you well. And immediately he, that's Bartimaeus, regained his sight and began following Jesus on the road. Sounds to me like Bartimaeus' faith saved him that day. That again is not mentioned, but when he starts following Jesus on the road to his death, you would suspect that he was a believer. I imagine most of you have heard this story a number of times, but have you stopped and realized that Bartimaeus immediately followed Jesus, just as the 12 did when he asked them to come with me and follow me, and that Bartimaeus was following Jesus down the hill into Jerusalem on the way to the cross. A worship meeting took place. Let me read from Luke 18, verse 43. And immediately Bartimaeus regained his sight. But Luke says he, I added to Bartimaeus, and began following him, Jesus, glorifying God. And when all the people saw it, remember there were a lot of people on the road with him, they gave praise to God. So at this healing, evidently between the two Jerichos, there was a celebration of blessing and praising God for the sight that Bartimaeus received. Actually, if you read we find in a second, I'll read from Matthew, we'll find that both blind men received their sight. So let's go back to Matthew and take a look at it, about the blind beggar, and find out, was he passive, and is that why Mark skipped him, or did he participate vocally? Matthew 20, verses 31 through 34. And the multitude sternly told them, both beggars, to be quiet. But they cried out all the more, saying, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. So apparently the second blind man also called Jesus Son of David. Jesus stopped, verses 32 here, and called them and said, what do you want me to do for you? They had asked him for mercy. He said, what is it that you want in the form of the mercy? They said to him, Lord, we want our eyes to be opened. And moved with compassion, catch this, Jesus touched their eyes. Mark just says he told him, hey, your faith did it, go ahead. But Matthew tells us he actually touched their eyes, probably to activate or support their faith. And immediately they regained their sight, and followed him. So apparently 2 people believed in Jesus and began to follow him all the way to the cross. Sounds like both men were vocal, both men were active, both men were asking for a healing, both men were healed. And since Jesus responded to Bartimaeus about his faith, we would assume the same would have been true of the second blind man. Well, there need be no concern for the records of this event having made contradictory statements. There is no way to verify that. Just simply there's 1 or 2. He was either leaving to Jericho or going to Jericho. In this case, it's possible that both would be true of Jesus between the tell and the actual new city. So, where does that leave us? Back in Israel, on the way to Jerusalem from Jericho. Both Jerichos. But while this is the last healing given in Mark, there was another episode in Jericho described by Luke. Another, in a sense, a healing, but another person who apparently gets saved in the process. I won't tell you anything except to say he was a small, short man by the name of Zacchaeus. Yes, I know you know all about the sycamore tree and why it's slick and so forth. Well, after we get through with Zacchaeus next time, then we will go the time after into chapter 11 of Mark and the triumphal entry, which we will remark is actually the coronation of Jesus as king. And remember, the Messiah was to be the king on David's throne eternally. Well, we're getting there. We will get there. It's going to take us another 4 times to make the city, but we'll get there. See you then.